Well, as Siobhan was saying, the responsibility of remembering the horrors of Auschwitz, confronting what it means for us all as what humans are capable of, and then to try and make sure that never again really means never again is something that I'm sure we'll all be thinking about today. Earlier, I spoke to the comedian and author David Baddiel. Among his many works that he's written, Jews Don't Count was one of them, an examination of anti-Semitism in modern Britain. So I asked him for his reflections on the significance of today. You've written very movingly about your own family's, you call it intergenerational trauma that you experienced from the Holocaust. So it feels like that really is the place to start with that story, because before the war, before the Holocaust, your mother, her parents had a pretty comfortable life in Germany. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah. So my grandparents on my mother's side were sort of semi-aristocratic, I guess. I mean, they were industrialists. My grandfather owned a brick factory in a place called Königsberg, which was in East Prussia. Due to the war, that's actually now Kaliningrad. It's not even part of Germany anymore, but it was this incredible city. Educational university city where Immanuel Kant was from. And they had a brick factory there, and when I've seen pictures, they had like this incredible society wedding. And yeah, then they lost everything. And when I wrote a book recently, a memoir, and actually I didn't know just how near the wire they came with never making it out. I always knew it was late. I always knew they didn't actually get out and come here until kind of August 1939, which is unbelievably close, obviously, to the war and to the stopping of emigration from Germany of Jews. But there are letters to the British Refugee Committee, the Anglo-Jewish Refugee Committee that was helping Jews, that essentially say, if you don't make it now, that's it. And then my mum was born in March 1939, which made it really, really difficult. So yeah, that's what happened. And then in terms of intergenerational trauma, I mean, it's such a complicated subject. They got here, they'd lost everything, most of their family was murdered. My grandfather was also interned on the Isle of Man, along with many other German Jewish refugees. He then became clinically depressed after the war. And what I write about a bit is how the intergenerational trauma is not straightforward, because my mum was a very extraordinary woman, and was very transgressive and crazy in a way that I kind of celebrate, but clearly has something to do with the idea of this life that she never got to lead.
I can't really kind of get my head around what it must have been like with the baby, your mother, to be leaving everything and the risk. And then you mentioned there about your grandfather being interred, because I think that was something that sort of surprised me as well, because you think of it, in many ways, of course it is, a very sort of proud part of British history, welcoming Jewish children in particular, but that wasn't quite the experience, was it, that your family had?
So to be clear, I mean, there's so many small details about the Holocaust that are maybe not understood. So one is that my grandfather was in a concentration camp before the war. So after Kristallnacht, which was in 1938, November 1938, loads of Jews, thousands of Jews, were sent to concentration camps, which were not at that time extermination camps, although still horrible, terrible places. He was in Dachau for 6 months, and they only just got him out. They basically bribed everything they had to get my grandfather out. And so then he arrives here thinking he's safe, and then in 1940, under pressure essentially from right-wing tabloids saying, what are all these Jews doing here? What are all these immigrants doing here? And the British government were at the time, for various reasons, some of them anti-Semitic, some of them political, not telling the country. The Ministry of Information wasn't telling the country why Jews were here. He just ordered the immediate internment of all Germans living in Britain in 1940, of whom 90% were Jewish refugees. So he then is on the Isle of Man, interned for 2 years. So all of that contributes to, in terms of intergenerational trauma, to the psychological trauma that my mother would have suffered as a very young child.
Can you talk to me a bit about your mother? Because she sounds kind of extraordinary.
Obviously there is tragedy and there is poignancy in the way that someone who's had those experiences might grow up, but there's also, for me, comedy. So for me, a lot of that book is about the fact that my mum had an affair with a golfing memorabilia salesman, golf that was really not a sport, that was a big deal in our house, although interestingly still mainly excluded to Jews in the 60s and 70s, because Jews weren't allowed into British golf clubs, and that might be one reason why she looked there to sort of sort things out. And what I think is that my mum, if she had lived in Königsberg, would have married probably some kind of Austrian sort of prince, And the nearest thing she could find in Cricklewood in 1970 was this kind of smooth golf guy. And that's kind of poignant and funny at the same time, right? It's like, one time it's funny, and it definitely is funny, and at another time it really tears me apart to think that when she says, she said to me once this thing about, I try to, she talked a lot about her affair being her attempt to live an exciting life, and I think what she meant by that was the life that she'd lost.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
That she's kind of thinking about the other life she could have had.
Yeah. I mean, she married my dad, right? So my dad, didn't really expect it to go like this, but anyway, the Holocaust Memorial Day conversation. But in a way, the individual stories are, that's the thing, they're all different and they're all detailed, and the specifics are really unusual and strange a lot of the time. And they're not all just straightforwardly sad with a capital S, right? Because my dad was a working class Welsh guy, and not, I think, what she would have expected. At the same time...
Not the prince, then.
Not the prince, but what you need to know about my dad, of course, is that he's Welsh, he's born in Wales, but he comes from fleeing Jewish refugees in the 19th century, who were fleeing from Cossacks and from Russian persecution. I mean, this is the thing about being... I did Who Do You Think You Are in the first series, and they always like to have a Jew in Who Do You Think You Are because they always like to have Nazis, because Nazis are basically fantastic TV. I've said it. But what I noticed when I did that, and I went to Kaliningrad, is that there's just the stumps of my grandparents' brick factory there. And when other people trace their history, it can be really intact. I think I remember at the time thinking, Ian Hislop, right now, he's probably at the manor house that his great-great-great-grandparents lived in, and it's all completely like it was then. But if you're Jewish, your history is one of fleeing and rubble.
It's very powerful to hear that the history is one of fleeing.
Yeah.
Because it's that, I guess, really shows the racism and the persecution that Jews have suffered throughout their history.
One of the things I say, it doesn't occur to me to say anything else, but it's say my mother was a refugee. My grandparents were refugees. But it's strange, because I think in this phenomenon that I've identified about Jews not counting, is that vocabulary isn't often granted to Jews, I think.
Do you feel that there is, I guess, a blind spot among progressives, among the left, about when it comes to the discrimination and the anti-Semitism that Jews have suffered?
Well, yeah, that's my thing with Jews Don't Count, is that it's specifically about, it's not about anti-Semitism in the sort of direct way, the, as it were, traditional way that's come from the far right. It's about how the people who would consider themselves to be most concerned about discrimination, about racism, about many, many different types of marginalisation, don't apply that when it comes to anti-Semitism. They just don't apply the same language. That's a good example, I think, of how I think even calling my mother a refugee is a slightly unusual thing.
Why do you think that is?
Despite the fact that Jewish history is a huge cyclical loop of disempowerment, the lingering sense that Jews are essentially invulnerable, that there is a lack of vulnerability, that they don't quite qualify as to fit into the class of victim, means that you get this constant issue. And of course that is made much more complex by what's happening at the moment.
Do you think there's been, I guess, a rise in anti-Semitism because of the war in Gaza?
I think there's anti-Semitism exists all the time. I think unquestionably events in the Middle East are continually conflated with ideas about Jews elsewhere, which is wrong. The idea that Jews have to answer for, Jews around the world, have to answer for or are considered complicit in things that happen miles and miles away is, again, something that is fairly unique to Jews. But I think that one of the things that needs to be understood, and in a way Holocaust Memorial Day is quite good for this, is I think that anti-Semitism is now very, very much thought of as consequent upon things that happen in the Middle East, whereas the State of Israel did not exist in the 1930s. The State of Israel was established 3 years after the war, and I think, I mean, I hear people saying that if Israel didn't exist, then anti-Semitism would sort of go away magically, sort of forgetting that the largest global anti-Semitic event happened just before the establishment of the state. So for me, it's a kind of unfortunately, a constant in the psyche of the West, in the psyche of everywhere where Jews are a minority, which is everywhere, except, in fact, Israel.
You have experienced anti-Semitism yourself. It feels to me like whenever you speak about anti-Semitism, you experience anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Well, I can only talk about my lived experience, but that seems specific to me about anti-Semitism as a type of racism, which is that speaking about your experience of it involves people getting furious about it. Because the way that we are asked to imagine the world sometimes now is in a very binary way, as in terms of victimizers and victimized, and oppressed and oppressors. And Jews are a kind of glitch in that binary, right? Because some Jews are powerful, but Jews have also this incredibly long history of, as I say, of disempowerment, of racism and discrimination against them, which means you can't think about the world in those easy ways when you think about anti-Semitism. And the easiest thing to do, therefore, is to dismiss anti-Semitism as a real issue. To say it's not real, it's all happened years ago, it's not an ongoing thing, and anyway, it's all about the Middle East. So why is he whinging about it? That's what tends to happen. And that's because people don't want to complexify that binary. They just want to think in terms of good and evil.
Yeah, which is just a completely reductive way of looking at the world.
It's not for me to speak about other people's terrible history, other minorities' terrible history. And I think, again, something that happens with the way that the Holocaust is particularly thought about is that some progressives, some far-right people, can decide this is a kind of exceptionalism, that we're giving too much space and too much highlighting to the Holocaust as opposed to any other tragedy. But actually, what needs to be understood is the specificity of the Holocaust, not necessarily prioritising it against any other tragedy or atrocity in the history of the world. It had very specific elements to it, a very specific type of mass psychosis in Germany, a politicised mass psychosis, and a very specific type of industrialisation of the process of killing. And those things are not mirrored in many, many other atrocities. And that, in a way, is why it's worth remembering, because that, in a way, does illustrate why it's the kind of darkness in humanity that we need to guard against.
Today, Holocaust Memorial Day, is there anything particular that you're going to be thinking about or remembering?
I tend to think about my great-uncle Arno, because I was quite close to my grandma, who was called Otti, and she lived in Cambridge for the rest of her life when she came here. And she spent a lot of her life trying to find what had happened to her younger brother. She went to the Red Cross after the war and tried to find out what had happened to Arno, who was her younger brother. And actually, when I was doing Who Do You Think You Are, they had found these postcards from the Red Cross, and he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he's written these postcards to my grandma, and they just say, "Pray for me." And I have a picture of him. I wrote a book called The Secret Purposes, which is about the internment of Jewish German refugees on the Isle of Man. It's mainly about my grandfather's life. And I didn't really know that much about Arno. And I dedicated that book to my grandparents. And then I found out, and I said to Ernst and Otti Fabian, survivors. And then I added, and to my great-uncle Arno, and didn't add the word survivor. And I think about him a lot. He looked very like a member of my family. And it's a member of my family that I never met, and I don't really know what happened to him.
How old was he roughly at the time? Do you know?
He would have been in his 30s.
Yeah. So you were a young man in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then the trial, you don't know?
Well, he either died in the ghetto, he most likely died in the ghetto, but that's one thing I did want to say, actually, which is, so one of the things about Holocaust Memorial Day that I think it's worth mentioning is it's the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and the liberation of Belsen, but there are so many other places that are not mentioned. So one of the reasons we know about Auschwitz, one of the reasons we know about Belsen is that there were survivors of Auschwitz because it was a labour camp as well as an extermination camp. And Belsen was liberated when people were starving, but the Allies managed to save some people. At Treblinka, at Sobibor, at Belzec, at Chelmno, these were totally dedicated extermination camps. Hundreds of thousands of people died there. And the reasons we don't know that is those people went straight to the gas vans or the gas chambers or the ovens or the forests to be shot. And my point is, the reason we don't know about those places, or very few people do, is there are no survivors.
Yeah.
Survivors are dying all the time now, the ones who did survive. So therefore the worry is we will soon not know any names.
That's the thing, isn't it? People who cannot tell their story
Yeah.
because they're not here to tell it.
Yeah.
Which is what happened with your relative in the Warsaw Ghetto as well.
Yeah. Well, I've tried to tell it a bit.
You have.
Yeah.
You definitely have,
Yeah.
which is great.
Yeah.
But it's been really, really powerful speaking to you today.
Thank
and
you,
we really
Sophie.
appreciate having you here to discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.